The air in October 1858 did not merely carry the crisp, cooling bite of a Georgia autumn. It was saturated with a thick, suffocating tension that the locals recognized as the scent of impending violence. On the grand wraparound porch of a mansion that served as a monument to inherited cruelty, Senator Cornelius Blackwood stood like a statue of iron and ice. At 52, he was a man who had never known the hollow ache of hunger or the sting of a lash, yet he governed with a ruthlessness that suggested he understood the mechanics of pain better than any man alive. His leather gloves, supple and expensive, were adjusted with a clinical precision that mirrored his political career in the state Senate, a career built entirely on the expansion of human bondage and the chilling efficiency of his notorious hunting expeditions. As the moonlight struck his steel-grey hair, his cold blue eyes scanned the dark tree line of the forest, looking not for game, but for a soul brave enough to try and reclaim its own life. Behind him, the mansion glowed with a deceptive warmth, its 12 massive white columns standing as silent witnesses to 12 years of political power bought with the sweat and blood of those he considered mere livestock. Inside, the muffled sound of a piano played by his wife Margaret drifted through the mahogany doors, a delicate melody that stood in grotesque contrast to the horror Blackwood was preparing to unleash into the night. The silence of the evening was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy rattle of iron chains as Jeremiah Cobb, the plantation's overseer, emerged from the shadows near the kennels. Cobb was a man forged in the fires of resentment. Born into the biting poverty of a landless white farmer, he had clawed his way into Blackwood's favor through a singular, unwavering commitment to cruelty. His face was a map of scars and bitterness, his eyes reflecting the hollow calculation of a man who knew his elevated status depended entirely on the continued degradation of those beneath him. To Cobb, the system of slavery was not just an economic necessity, but a religion, and he served as its most fervent inquisitor. At his heels were 3 massive bloodhounds, their muscles rippling beneath dark pelts, their eyes reflecting a predatory hunger that matched their master's own. The largest, a beast named Caesar, was a legend of terror across the county, responsible for the capture and mauling of over 30 runaways. His teeth were stained with the memory of old blood, and his low, guttural growl was a sound that could extinguish the hope of the bravest heart. "Senator," Cobb called out, his voice thick with the gravel of a man who drank whiskey to forget his origins and used violence to remember his power. "The boy has a head start since sundown. He thinks the dark is his friend, but the hounds already have the taste of him." Blackwood's lips twisted into a thin, predatory smile that held no warmth, the kind of expression a wolf might wear before the final spring. "That is what makes the night sporting, Jeremiah," he replied, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. "They always run, and they always fail. Fear is a predictable master. It turns their legs to water and their minds to mush. They run until they collapse, and then they learn the true cost of their arrogance." But as Blackwood adjusted his rifle, he was operating under a fatal delusion. He understood fear as a whip, a tool used to break the spirit and ensure submission. He did not yet grasp that fear, when pushed to its absolute limit, undergoes a terrifying chemical transformation. It ceases to be a weight and becomes a catalyst, a white-hot flame that burns away every instinct except the primal, unyielding will to survive and be free. He believed he was hunting a terrified animal, a boy who had finally snapped under the pressure of his station. He did not realize that the man in the woods, Marcus Washington, was no longer the servant who poured his brandy. Marcus was 35 years of age, a man of staggering physical presence who stood 6 feet tall and possessed a frame forged by decades of backbreaking labor. But his true danger did not lie in his muscles. It lay in his mind. Marcus had spent his life as an observer in the house of his enemy, a silent ghost who had learned to read in the flickering shadows of the senator's own library, taught in secret by a daughter who had long since fled the cruelty of her father's house. While Blackwood saw a mindless brute, Marcus saw a system of cracks and weaknesses. He had watched the patterns of the hunt for years, forced to assist in the capture of his own brothers and sisters, and every successful hunt had been a lesson etched into his memory. He knew the geography of the Georgia woods better than the men who claimed to own them, every treacherous marsh, every hollowed-out oak, and every Cherokee trail that stayed dry even in the heaviest rains. But the catalyst for his flight was not a sudden desire for his own liberty, it was the pure, righteous rage of a protector. Earlier that evening, while serving the senator and his guests, Marcus had overheard the cold, clinical discussion regarding the sale of his younger sister, Sarah. They spoke of her sewing skills and her breeding potential as if she were a prize heifer, debating the price she would fetch at a notorious plantation in Alabama, where women were treated with a brutality that defied description. Sarah was 19, a gentle soul who dreamt in the colors of the quilts she stitched in secret. The thought of her being cast into that darkness had ignited a fire in Marcus that no lash could extinguish. As the hunting party mounted their horses, a collection of wealthy plantation owners and politicians eager for the entertainment of the chase, Marcus was already deep within the green cathedral of the forest. He did not run in a blind panic, nor did he head directly for the North Star as they expected. Instead, he moved with a calculated, rhythmic grace, his body coated in the very mud and pine needles of the earth he intended to defend. He was not escaping. He was preparing a battlefield. He remembered the magic shows the senator hosted for his white guests, where the key to every trick was misdirection, giving the audience exactly what they expected to see while the real work happened in the shadows. Marcus began to weave a web of deception, dragging his discarded shirt through briars to create false scent trails and snapping branches in a way that suggested a clumsy, terrified flight toward the swamp. He knew the hunting party would be led by their own arrogance, believing that a black man was incapable of strategy. He understood that their strength, their horses, their rifles, and their hounds could be turned into their greatest liabilities if they were lured into the right terrain. He crouched behind a fallen oak, his massive frame nearly invisible against the textured bark, and listened to the distant rhythmic thud of hooves and the excited, bloodthirsty baying of the dogs. "Let's show these animals what happens when they forget their place." Blackwood's voice boomed through the trees, carrying the weight of a man who believed the world belonged to him by divine right. The hunting party consisted of 8 armed men, including Judge William Crawford, a man whose portly frame belied a soul of staggering malice, and young David Ashford, a 21-year-old who looked ill at ease with the violence his social standing required him to witness. They rode with torches held high, the orange light casting long, distorted shadows that danced like demons against the ancient pines. They expected a short night and a bloody conclusion. They did not notice the subtle shifting of the forest floor or the way the wind seemed to carry Marcus's scent in 3 different directions at once. Marcus watched them from the darkness, his heart beating with a steady, calm resolve. For 35 years he had been the prey, a man whose very existence was subject to the whims of others. But as the first torchlight flickered near his first trap, Marcus felt the chains of his mind fall away. The hunt had indeed begun, but as the moon climbed higher into the sky, the roles were already beginning to blur. The predator was about to learn that when you hunt a man who has nothing left to lose, you are no longer the one in control. The hunting party rode deeper into the ancient, whispering pines, their confidence as bright and fragile as the torch flames they carried. Leading the charge was Thomas Hartwell, a young man whose ambition to impress the older aristocrats far outweighed his experience in the treacherous Georgia backwoods. The trail narrowed significantly here, squeezed between 2 gargantuan oaks whose roots clawed at the earth like the fingers of a buried giant. This was the exact bottleneck Marcus had identified hours earlier. Beneath a carpet of deceptively innocent pine needles and fallen leaves lay a shallow but strategically placed pit. It wasn't designed to kill, but to maim the momentum of the pursuit. As Hartwell's horse galloped into the gap, its front legs suddenly plunged into the false floor, the ground giving way with a sickening, hollow crunch. The animal's momentum sent Hartwell hurtling forward over the horse's head, his body slamming into the hard-packed clay. The scream that tore from his throat was high and jagged, instantly harmonizing with the terrified, high-pitched neighing of the horse as its forelegs snapped under the weight of the fall. The sudden explosion of violence shattered the air of a gentleman's sport, replacing it with the raw, visceral reality of a battlefield. Jeremiah Cobb reined in his mount with a savage jerk, his face contorting into a mask of disbelief and burgeoning fury. He had spent 15 years tracking men through these woods, and he had never encountered a runaway who possessed the cold-blooded patience to dig a tactical pit. The bloodhounds, usually so focused and relentless, began to whirl in frantic circles, their noses twitching as they encountered the overlapping scent trails Marcus had painstakingly laid. Marcus had dragged his clothing through pungent swamp mud, rubbed it against the musk of a killed hog, and even used the juice of bitter berries to mask his human odor. The dogs, overwhelmed by the sensory bombardment, began to bay in a discordant, confused chorus, their predatory instincts short-circuiting. "Jeremiah, get those hounds in line!" Blackwood roared, his own horse skittish and wild-eyed from the scent of fresh blood. But the overseer was struggling. The dogs were no longer hunting a man. They were fighting the forest itself. In the shadows just 20 yards away, Marcus watched the chaos unfold. He felt no joy in the horse's suffering, but he felt a grim satisfaction in seeing the precision of his plan. For the first time in his life, he wasn't reacting to their violence. He was dictating it. Leaving the broken Hartwell and a few shaken riders behind to tend to the horse, Blackwood pushed the remaining men forward, his rage now acting as a blindfold to the mounting danger. Marcus melted away into the darkness, moving with a silent, rhythmic grace toward his second staging ground, a rocky outcropping that loomed over the serpentine curve of the Blackwood Creek. He knew the riders would be forced to water their horses there. The animals were already foaming at the mouth from the frantic pace and the humid October night. As he climbed the familiar limestone shelf, Marcus looked down at the wide, moonlit crossing. For years, he had been forced to stand in this very water, acting as a human anchor for the senator's boats or a pack animal for his hunting gear. He knew every loose stone on the ridge above and every deep hole in the creek bed below. He had spent the afternoon weaving a thick, resilient rope from grapevine fibers, anchoring a cluster of heavy river stones and timber to a single tension-filled knot. From this height, the hunting party looked small, insignificant specks of orange light crawling through a vast, indifferent wilderness. The sound of hooves splashing into the shallow water echoed through the gorge, a rhythmic slapping of stone against current. Senator Blackwood entered the water first, his rifle resting across his saddle, his eyes darting toward the tree line with a newfound sense of paranoia. Beside him rode Judge Crawford and Edmund Fairfax, their horses snorting and stamping, sensing the unnatural stillness of the ridge above them. "Something is wrong, Cornelius," Crawford whispered, his voice trembling as he wiped sweat from his upper lip. "A boy doesn't plan a pit trap. A boy doesn't confuse hounds like this. We're being led." Blackwood didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the reflection of the moon in the water, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. "He's a man who has forgotten his place, William," Blackwood finally hissed, though the conviction in his voice was fraying at the edges. "And I will be the one to remind him of it. I will skin him for the time he's wasted tonight." He didn't see Marcus standing on the ledge, a dark silhouette against the stars, holding the grapevine rope. Marcus felt the weight of his sister's future in his hands. One pull would change the trajectory of their lives forever. With a sudden, deliberate heave, Marcus released the tension. The avalanche of stone and timber did not fall with a roar, but with a series of sharp, thunderous cracks as it gathered momentum down the steep slope. The impact with the water was spectacular. A geyser of spray and silt erupted into the air, dousing the torches and plunging the creek into a chaotic, strobe-lit nightmare. Stones the size of a man's chest slammed into the shallow bed, sending waves of freezing water over the riders. Judge Crawford's horse, struck in the flank by a tumbling log, reared and threw the portly man into the swiftest part of the current. His terrified cries were swallowed by the rushing water as he was swept toward the deeper, treacherous bends of the river. Edmund Fairfax was struck in the shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him out of his saddle like a rag doll. The creek, which had been a quiet sanctuary for the plantation's elite, had become a churning death trap of mud and stone. Through the spray, Marcus saw Blackwood desperately fighting to keep his horse from bolting, his face illuminated by a solitary, sputtering torch held by a terrified David Ashford. As the dust and spray settled, a heavy, oppressive silence returned to the gorge, broken only by the whimpering of a dog and the distant, fading shouts of the drowning judge. Blackwood looked up, his eyes finally locking onto the massive figure standing on the outcropping. In that moment, the psychological foundation of Blackwood's world suffered a terminal blow. He wasn't looking at a piece of property or a runaway animal. He was looking at an architect of ruin. The moonlight carved Marcus's features out of the darkness, a face devoid of the fear that Blackwood had used to govern his life. "You!" Blackwood screamed, his voice cracking with a high, desperate edge that he couldn't suppress. "I will burn every inch of these woods to find you. I will sell your sister to the devil himself." But Marcus did not answer with words. He simply turned and vanished into the thicket, moving toward the third and final trap he had prepared in the grove of young pines. He knew Blackwood would follow, driven by a toxic mixture of pride and terror, and he knew that by the time the sun rose, the senator would be forced to acknowledge a truth that no law in Georgia could ever erase. Marcus retreated deeper into the heart of the forest, moving into a dense thicket of young pines where the canopy was so thick it seemed to swallow the moonlight whole. This was the Green Cathedral, a place where the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and resin, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight. Here, Marcus had spent hours weaving a complex web of snares and counterweights using the natural tension of the saplings and the resilience of wild vines. He moved through the darkness with a predator's grace, his bare feet whispering over the soft needles, his mind a cold map of every tripwire and release knot he had concealed. He knew that the survivors of the creek would be driven by a desperate, frantic energy, their earlier arrogance replaced by a jagged, reactive fear. They would be looking at the shadows, expecting an attack from the brush, never realizing that the very trees above them had been transformed into weapons. Marcus climbed into the sturdy branches of an ancient oak that overlooked the clearing, his dark skin, masked by mud and pine needles, blending perfectly with the textured bark. He was no longer a man running for his life. He was a ghost, inhabiting a world he had claimed as his own. The sound of the pursuit reached the grove, but it was no longer the rhythmic thud of a disciplined hunting party. It was the staggered, uneven gait of exhausted horses and the heavy breathing of men who had stared into the abyss and seen their own insignificance. Jeremiah Cobb led the way, his face a bruised mask of mud and fury, his eyes darting with the frantic intensity of a cornered animal. Behind him, Senator Blackwood and the young David Ashford rode in a tight, defensive formation, their torches flickering low and casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to reach for them from the trees. Cobb, desperate to regain his status as the ultimate tracker, pushed his horse into the center of the grove. His eyes scanning the ground for the footprints, he expected a panicked runaway to leave. He didn't see the thin, dark line of the grapevine snare hidden beneath a dusting of needles. As his horse's hoof caught the loop, the counterweighted sapling Marcus had bent to the breaking point snapped upward with a violent, whip-like crack. The snare tightened around Cobb's ankle, yanking him from his saddle with such force that the air was driven from his lungs in a sharp, wet gasp. Jeremiah Cobb swung upward, suspended upside down from a pine branch, his arms flailing uselessly as he spun in the dark. The sight of the plantation's most feared overseer dangling like a piece of butchered meat broke the last remnants of the group's composure. The remaining horses, already pushed to the brink of madness, reared and bucked, their hooves striking the earth with hollow thuds. One of the militia riders was thrown into a cluster of brambles, his torch extinguishing as it hit the damp ground, leaving him to groan in a darkness he could no longer navigate. Blackwood found himself alone with David Ashford, the two of them surrounded by the eerie, rhythmic creaking of the ropes and the muffled babbling of the semi-conscious Jeremiah. The hounds, finally catching Marcus's true scent, looked up into the canopy and began to howl, a mournful, frustrated sound that echoed through the cathedral like a funeral dirge. "Come out!" Blackwood screamed into the trees, his voice high and trembling with a rage that was indistinguishable from terror. "I know you're there, you animal! Face me!" Marcus's voice didn't come from the brush, but from the darkness high above, calm and measured, carrying a weight of authority that stopped the senator's breath in his throat. "I am facing you, Senator," Marcus said, the words echoing off the surrounding pines. "For the first time in 35 years, I am looking at you as an equal, and it seems that without your chains and your hounds, you are just a man who is very much afraid." The psychological impact of the word equal hit Blackwood with the force of a physical blow. His entire worldview, the foundation of his power, and his very identity were predicated on the absolute belief that Marcus was subhuman. To hear that belief challenged with such quiet, unwavering dignity in the middle of a forest that had become a death trap was more than his mind could process. He raised his rifle toward the sound, his hands shaking so violently the barrel traced erratic circles in the air. "You are property!" Blackwood shrieked, the word a desperate prayer to a god that had abandoned him. "You are nothing but a beast I bought and paid for." "Then why are you trembling before a beast, Senator?" Marcus asked, his voice closer now. Before Blackwood could react, Marcus dropped from the branches of the oak, landing with a soft, heavy thud just 6 feet away. He rose to his full height, a massive, mud-caked figure that seemed to absorb the dim light of the dying torches. The moonlight revealed the intelligence in his eyes, a sharp, calculating light that saw through Blackwood's finery to the hollow, frightened core of the man. David Ashford, seeing the giant emerge from the shadows, felt the last of his resolve evaporate. With a cry of pure, unadulterated panic, the young man wheeled his horse around and spurred it into the darkness, fleeing the grove with no thought for direction or duty. He disappeared into the trees, the sound of his frantic flight fading into the distance, leaving Senator Cornelius Blackwood alone in the silence. The master of the Georgia Senate, the architect of 100 laws designed to crush the spirit of men like Marcus, stood paralyzed as his horse shied away from the man it now recognized as the true authority in the forest. Marcus stepped into the small circle of light, his presence commanding the space with a silent, righteous fury. He reached out and took the horse's bridle, his hand steady and firm, instantly calming the animal. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the hunter and the prey, the master and the slave, their roles now completely and irrevocably inverted. Blackwood looked at Marcus, and, for the first time in his life, he saw a human being. He saw the scars of the labor he had demanded, the strength of the mind he had tried to stifle, and the absolute, terrifying freedom of a man who had decided he would rather die than spend another second in chains. The rifle in Blackwood's hands felt like a toy, a useless relic of a world that no longer existed. "The hunt is over, Senator," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "Now, we are going to talk about my sister. And then, we are going to talk about the future." The sun was still hours away, but in the heart of the Green Cathedral the old world had already died, and a new dangerous light was beginning to dawn. The silence that descended upon the grove after Ashford's frantic departure was more oppressive than the baying of the hounds had ever been. Senator Cornelius Blackwood sat atop his shivering horse, his body rigid, his hands gripping the leather reins so tightly the knuckles threatened to burst through the skin. Before him stood Marcus, a monument of muscle and mud, whose presence seemed to warp the very reality Blackwood had inhabited for 52 years. The single remaining torch, stuck into the soft earth where a rider had fallen, cast a flickering, hellish orange glow upward, carving deep, jagged shadows into Marcus's face. For the first time, Blackwood was forced to look, truly look, at the man he had called his property. He saw not the bowed head of a servant, but the piercing, intelligent gaze of a sovereign. The senator's rifle lay forgotten in the pine needles, a useless iron reed. The hierarchy of Georgia, the laws of the South, and the divine right of the planter class had all evaporated in the damp night air. Marcus did not move to strike. He simply held the horse's bridle with a calm, terrifying authority that the animal respected more than Blackwood's spurs. "Look at me, Senator," Marcus whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to originate from the earth itself. "Look at the animal you chased through the dark. Tell me, do you see fear in my eyes, or do you only see the reflection of your own?" The internal world of Cornelius Blackwood was experiencing a tectonic shift, a violent dismantling of every certainty he had ever held. He had spent his political life crafting speeches about the natural order, about the inherent intellectual and moral deficits of the African race that necessitated the benevolent guidance of men like himself. But every trap Marcus had set, every false scent he had laid, and the cold strategic brilliance of this entire night was a direct, irrefutable contradiction of those speeches. Marcus had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought the finest hunting party the county could assemble, and he had done it with the patient precision of a master architect. The senator felt a sickening wave of vertigo. If Marcus was his equal in mind and his superior in spirit, then Blackwood's entire life, his wealth, his mansion, his reputation, was not a testament to his greatness, but a record of a prolonged, systematic crime. I have money, Blackwood stammered, his voice thin and reedy, stripped of its oratorical thunder. I can provide you with gold, with horses. I can give you papers that will take you all the way to the Canadian border. Just let me ride out of here. Let us forget this night happened. He was bargaining now, not from a position of mercy, but from a desperate, clawing need to preserve the illusion of his world. Marcus's laughter was a short, sharp sound that held no mirth, only the bitter resonance of truth. You offer me papers as if freedom is a gift in your pocket to give, Marcus said, stepping closer until the heat of his breath was visible in the cool air. I took my freedom the moment I stepped off your porch. I don't need your ink and your parchment to tell me I am a man. He reached up, his massive hand hovering near Blackwood's chest, not to grasp him, but to emphasize the proximity of their shared humanity. I stayed in the shadows tonight when I could have ended you at the creek. I watched you tremble when the rocks fell, and I watched you weep when your friends abandoned you. I could have left your body for the vultures, and no one would have known but the trees. Do you know why I didn't? Blackwood shook his head, his throat too constricted to speak. Because if I killed you, I would be the monster you want me to be. I would be the animal you describe in your Senate speeches. By letting you live, I am forcing you to carry the weight of the truth. You are going to live with the knowledge that a man you called property spared your life because he was more of a man than you will ever be. The psychological weight of this mercy was heavier than any blow Marcus could have landed. It was a total moral conquest. The terms of the engagement were no longer about survival, but about the dismantling of Blackwood's legacy. Marcus leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, deadly serious tone. The sale of my sister Sarah ends tonight. You will return to that mansion, and you will sign her manumission papers, and you will do the same for every soul on your land. You will provide them with the wages they have earned through years of stolen labor, and you will assist them in finding passage to where they wish to go. Blackwood's eyes widened with a fresh surge of panic. That is ruin, Marcus. You are asking for the destruction of everything I have built. Marcus's grip on the bridle tightened, pulling the horse's head down. What you built was a monument to suffering, Senator. It was never yours to begin with. You have a choice. You can become the man who realized his errors and sought justice, or you can be the man whose humiliation is whispered in every tavern and parlor from here to Savannah. I will tell them how you begged. I will tell them how Jeremiah hung from a tree while you shivered in your saddle. I will strip the mask of master from your face until there is nothing left but the coward beneath. In the distance, the faint, rhythmic drumming of many hooves began to pulse through the forest floor. Young Ashford had reached the outer settlements, and the alarm had been raised. A larger search party, militia, overseers, and perhaps federal marshals was converging on the grove, their torches already visible as a distant orange glow through the thicket. Time was dissolving. Marcus looked at the approaching light and then back at the broken man in the saddle. They are coming for a hunt, Senator. They expect to find a runaway in chains and a master in control. What they find is entirely up to you. The choice was the ultimate test of Blackwood's soul. He could cry out for help, reclaim his status through the violence of the mob, and perhaps see Marcus hung from the very oak he had dropped from. But he knew with a soul-deep certainty that if he did, he would never be able to look in a mirror again without seeing a ghost. He would be the man who was shown the ultimate mercy and responded with the ultimate betrayal. Marcus released the bridle, stepping back into the shadows of the pines, disappearing before Blackwood's eyes even as he remained a palpable presence in the air. The dawn is coming, Cornelius, the voice whispered from the dark. Decide who you are before the light finds you.